So this morning's reading comes from the Gospel of Mark, which is really sort of the action-adventure gospel. If you ever spend any time in the Gospels, you will recognize that if you want to go somewhere and get there fast, look in the Gospel of Mark. It's the shortest, it was probably the earliest written, and Mark does not waste any amount of time, right? So it's just like boom, boom, story after story after story after story after story, right? And we get this really kind of like almost frenetic sense about Jesus and the disciples and what was going on. By the way, if you Google action figure Jesus, you get a lot of options. But this is what we have. I mean, it really is. This is the action Jesus version of what's going on in the story. And it introduces a couple of Mark's favorite words. And two of his favorite words are immediately and amazed, right? And Mark uses immediately all the time. He uses amazed all the time. They almost like should show up in like those Batman words, right? Like from like back in the day. I used to watch this on Nick at Night. It was a good show. Adam West. I met him once. Good guy. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But it is. It's like immediately this and immediately that and immediately this. And so we get this real sense of like this kind of fast-paced story in the Gospel of Mark. And so we come to this point here, and we're in all of chapter 2, if you have noticed. Mark doesn't have any kind of birth story the way that Matthew and Luke does. In Mark, we just start off with kind of this fully grown Jesus, and Jesus gets straight to work. And this story here is the fourth healing or otherwise miracle that happens in the first 2 chapters of the book. Right? And so Jesus kind of gets on the scene, he's baptized by John, then he's off to the races, and the first thing he does is go on this tour around the land, and part of that is he's offering healing in all of these various places. Now, this story also introduces another person or group that's going to be important to Gospel of Mark's story, and that's this group called the scribes. And the scribes sort of show up as this kind of generic placeholder for this group of religious leaders of the day who will eventually become very threatened by what Jesus is doing. So we get this introduction of the scribes here. Apparently Jesus has raised such a ruckus already, even though he's very new into his ministry. People are starting to take notice of what's going on to a large degree, that now the authorities are aware of Jesus and they show up to see kind of what's up. So the scribes show up and they find out Jesus is going to be in this town. So the scribes show up and they try to see what's going on with this guy over here and what is he talking about and what is he doing. Now, it says in here that the scribes introduced, if you follow the through line of the scribes will be the ones at the end of the Gospel of Mark who eventually put Jesus on trial. And what they eventually put him on trial for is this charge of blasphemy that begins all the way back here in chapter 2, right? So we have the stage being set right at the beginning of the story for what we all know is coming at the end of the story. So this is one of Jesus' healing miracles. He's there, he's doing, he's healed a lot of folks. In fact, the only reason that there is a crowd around Jesus now is that he had healed somebody a couple of towns away earlier in the chapter, told that guy, hey, don't tell anybody. He didn't listen, right? He went and told everybody, which is why everyone started showing up, and these guys show up with their friend on the mat, right? Because they've become aware of there's this guy, his name is Jesus, and he can do some really cool stuff. So we have this basic healing story, and in the middle of it, we got this little altercation between the scribes and Jesus. Now, one of the challenges that we can sometimes have in this scripture, we're not going to deal with this too much this morning. Come to Deeper Dive if you want to talk about it more. I'm a little commercial for you. But there is this challenge of, is Jesus trying to say, are we supposed to take from this that somehow the man is crippled because for some reason either he or his parents sinned? Well, in John's gospel, Jesus is very clear that's not how it works, right? And if you look at it, if you look at the story, the guy, his friends are desperate, right? They're like, hey, we've got our buddy here. He's been crippled. He can't work. He can't support himself. He can't support his family. Like, maybe this Jesus guy can help. They go to these extraordinary lengths, taking the roof off. Like, it was probably like a thatched roof. They took the roof off. Don't do that, by the way. We got doors. We got lots of doors. Just come in a door. That wasn't an option for them. So they take the roof off and they lower it in. And then Jesus sees these people and this amazing thing that had happened. He's like, obviously, you think I can do something cool. So Jesus goes up to the guy and says, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. Your sins are forgiven. And then nothing happens if you notice. And so you can just imagine sitting there, he's like, thanks, right? That's wonderful. Not why I came here, because, the crippled. Which sets off this whole thing between Jesus and the scribes, and then we get the scribes, and they get their little allocation, and then Jesus finally goes back to the guy, and there's almost a moment, it's like, oh yeah, sorry, sins are forgiven, and get up and walk. And now the guy does, like, oh, okay, great. So the guy gets up and walks, and immediately, right, our friend immediately leaves, everybody's amazed, right? This is the story that we run into over and over and over again of Jesus doing these things, these amazing miracles that happen over and over and over again. And what's interesting is almost always, almost without exception, not completely without exception, almost without exception, Jesus comes into a place and he does something important for the people who are right in front of him at that moment. When Jesus heals, he heals the people in front of him. When he goes to eat in somebody's house who he shouldn't go to because they're not the right kind of people, he takes the invitation of the people who are in front of him. Jesus isn't afraid to do good to those who are around him. He's not afraid to give what he can to those around him that need it. And in fact, before we get into any sort of teaching, right, we don't get any parables in Mark's gospel until chapter 4. We don't get any teachings in the story for the first 3 chapters. What we get in the first 3 chapters is Jesus going around to all of these various places, doing the good that Jesus can do. And I think that's intentional. I imagine it starts that way for a reason. And part of the reason is, as followers of Christ, we are called to do the same. We are called to do the good to those that we can, and we're called to do good to those who are in front of us, whoever they might be. Now, this hasn't always been the case. This hasn't always been how Christians have seen things. You might remember from your history book, there were these people called the Puritans, and they had really great hats, right? Amazing hats, right? We should still have hats like the Puritans had hats. But there was this group called the Puritans. They were a group from England, and they were sort of popular for a while, and then not popular for a while, and then kind of popular again. And eventually they finally said, forget it, we're out of here. And a lot of them came on ships, got on ships and came across the ocean, and were some of the first settlers in what would eventually become, the colonies that eventually become the United States, right? I mean, so the Puritans are kind of one of those parts of our history, and one of the things that we talk about in kind of the history of our own country is that a lot of those folks who originally came here came to practice looking for some sort of religious freedom, were being persecuted for some reason, and came here looking for a place where they could practice their religion. And that certainly was part of their story, and it's something that we celebrate as part of who we are, as a place that provides an opportunity for folks to practice their religion, whatever it is. Now, what we sometimes forget is part of the religion they wanted to practice was a little bit being jerks to one another, because they kind of were. Now, the Puritans had some things going on for them, but one of the things that they kind of had this idea, and they had this idea of like hard work, and hard work was valuable and important, and certainly that's an ideal we all carry forward today. But what Puritans were not known for is charity by any means. And actually, they were sort of anti-charity in a way. The idea was, if you didn't have something you needed, or if something bad had happened in your life, obviously God wanted that bad thing to happen in your life, so we're not going to take any responsibility for that. Which sounds, I suppose, appealing if nothing bad has happened to you. Right? Or you were born into a family that had some wealth or whatever, like it probably sounded pretty good until something happens, right? And you can kind of see why there's this ebb and this flow as far as, the embracing of Puritan ideas and maybe the letting go of Puritan ideas. But it's very much in the water, and it's very much in the water in England in the 16th and 17th century. It comes over here, and it is still something that is still around and discussed and talked about and still sort of debated when we get to these couple of guys known as John and Charles Wesley, who come onto the scene and start this movement called Methodism. Well, they didn't call it Methodism, that was sort of put upon them, right? And so John and Charles Wesley come and they start this movement called Methodism, and Methodism is a lot of things, but one of the things from the very beginning that gets buried deep into the DNA of what it is to be a Methodist is this idea that if there is somebody in front of you that needs some care, we're supposed to actually care. Right? Early in the Methodist movement, it was expected if you wanted to be part of one of the societies and you wanted to do and be a Methodist and be a member and all that sort of things, and had come to the singing and the preaching and all the good stuff, they would regularly expect you to do things like visit the prisoner, visit the sick, take up offerings and collections for the homeless and the needy, right? We oftentimes remember about the story of the kind of founding of Methodism. Wesley was that he was a great preacher, and Charles Wesley was a great songwriter. Absolutely, and he was well known for that. And in fact, before we had things like radio and recording, record players and stuff, it was estimated that more people heard John Wesley's voice than any other human being on earth, because he just preached that much. And we remember him that today. What we don't often remember was in the day is that Methodists were very controversial, and one of the things they were controversial for was how much good they were trying to do in the world. And in fact, we were labeled early on in the movement as do-gooders, and they didn't consider that to be a good thing, right? But Wesley said, no, I think there's this guy named Jesus, and I think he taught us some stuff, and I think one of the things he asked us to do is to bring good and life into the world. And really what Wesley is talking about is the same thing that Jesus lived, which is this idea that we are called to incarnate. This idea, one of the most unique claims that the Christian faith makes is this idea that God came in the form of Jesus to be with us. Not God's messenger, not God's prophet, not God's anything else, God. God came in this person of Jesus to come and be and hang out and break bread with and heal and bless and teach and do all of those things. God came to come and be with us. It's the water we live in. It's the air we breathe. We sometimes forget that that is a crazy and radical notion. It was radical 2,000 years ago, and it remains radical today. Because if we are going to follow Jesus in the way that Christians are, then it is also our job to take God's grace and God's love and incarnate it in the world. God said it's not enough just to send messengers anymore. They got to see it. They got to see me. They got to experience it. They got to experiencing me, not in between, but directly. So God came, and God was incarnate with us. And as followers of Christ, it is our job to then incarnate God's love and God's grace in all of the ways that we can, following the example that Jesus gave. John Wesley realizes this and kind of reclaims that and brings it back into the fold in this idea that when we bless one another, when we do good in the world, we don't just do it because it is a good thing to do. We do it because as followers of Christ, we can do no less. We are called to be do-gooders. We are called to put love and joy and grace into the world. We are called to care for people, which can feel overwhelming until we recognize the truth is that we are also called to Jesus to do what Jesus did and care for those who are in front of us, to care for those that God has given us to care for. So I want to talk about a couple things that we already do in this place that really kind of lives this out. So as many of you probably know, is I have a puppet, and his name is Peep. It's Peep. I like Peep. Peep and I have a good time. So somewhere, apparently, 20-some years ago or whenever it was, I'm sure someone will tell me for sure, you all made a really smart decision and opened a preschool in this place so that I would have a place to come to with my puppet. It's like you knew I was coming, right? And so every once in a while, I get to do this amazing thing where I get to actually take part of my day and go downstairs and read kids' stories with puppets, which is great because I am at least literate. I got that going for me. And I can read usually children's books at age that, if they're a 3 or 4-year-old level book, I've got that one. Like, we're good. We're good. But I love to go read my story. I love to go read stories, and I love to just be down there in the preschool. It is such a place full of life and energy and excitement. It's good times. It's really hilarious that I'm going to talk about this today, given that Carrie Ann and Kimberly neither of them are here. So, yeah. Tell them I said nice things. Anyway, actually, this doesn't have anything, but yesterday, or when was it? I don't know, Friday, someday. Anyway, I was sitting in the kitchen. We were setting up a rummage sale, and I heard music from downstairs. And music coming from downstairs usually means that it's dancing time. And I'm like, I could go for some dancing, right? So I go downstairs, and sure enough, they're doing silly dances, and Kimberly's leaving. I'm like, I can do silly dances. So I just kind of jump in there and do silly dances. We're having a good time, and then the music stops, and I'm like, all right, nice, good to see you. Realizing only afterwards that because it's a new school year, those kids have no idea who on earth I am. Kind of had to go back and apologize. Like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to random guy who just sort of showed up and danced and then left. That was a little weird. Okay. But we have this thing. We have this amazing thing. We call the Johnstown United Methodist Preschool. And it's something that we do in this church. We've invested a lot of time and energy in over the years. Now, what's interesting is back in, I wrote the year down. Yeah, between 1962 and 1967, they did a study. And the study was the Perry Preschool Project. And in the Perry Preschool Project, they identified a whole group of kids, 120 some odd kids, who were from at-risk families and in at-risk situations. And they took half of the kids, and they gave half of those kids high-quality access to preschool. And then the other half, they just let happen whatever was already going to happen to them. And that was the only difference between these groups of kids. And then they followed them. And now, since they did this in the 60s, we've been calling these families for about 50 years now. And it was one of those things we wanted to find out, does this make a difference in these kids' lives? Can you find any statistically significant difference between these groups of children who otherwise were very similar? Well, they did. After all this time, they found out that later in life, in their teenage years, they actually had fewer teen pregnancies, significantly. They had much higher graduation rates from high school, 60% for the group that did not get preschool education, 77% for those who did. They found out that even later in life, the people who got the preschool committed fewer crimes. They were more likely to hold a job for longer, had higher earning income, and were more likely to own a house and a car. Because 3 and 4-year-olds got to go to a place to learn some basic skills about life, some basic skills about the classroom, be loved on by some amazing teachers, and be invested in just a few hours a week. Now, they did this study, and that study is great, and that's one of those things that's helpful when you want to have to go after grant money or whatever it is. But the truth is, we don't need a study to tell us what we know in this place of the impact that we are making on the kids that come through our door. And I don't know how to fix things for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old, but I know we can make a difference in the 60-some every year that come into this place and are part of the ministry that we have. And I know we make a difference in their lives. And I know the teachers that receive them in 1st and 2nd and 3rd grade tell us that they're more and better prepared. We know that confidence comes from that. We know that they get to be in a place where they are loved and excited and accepted for who they are. All in just a few hours a week and a little bit of space in a part of the building that my guess is many of you have never even been in. We love, we do good for the ones that are in front of us. We do the good that we can do because that's what God asks us to do. A couple of years ago, there was a flood. A flood happened in this area, and many things came out of that thing, but one of the things that we came out of that was this realization that there were a lot of people in our community and in the community of Milliken who didn't have a lot of food generally with them in their food pantries. So people were, there was a lot of food in what we call food insecurity, that there was a lot more food insecurity in our community than maybe we knew before, and that if you're going to go and be cut off from basically the rest of the world for a couple of days, it helps if you actually have some food in your home to sustain yourself while that happens. Now, for a lot of us, that wouldn't be a concern. If you've seen my pantry, I could probably feed my family for a month on what's in my pantry if I'm willing to get a little bit of creative. But what we learned is that that's not the truth for so many people in our community. And there was a sense of like, well, I don't know how to stop the next flood, because I don't. If you do, that would be great. But I do know how to make sure that people have the opportunity to make sure they've got a little bit more food in their pantry. And what's interesting is this showed up, and it showed up as a need in the community. And who's the one who came together? Where were the place that they went and said, hey, we can do something about that? Well, it happens it was this church. And it was the Presbyterian Church in Milliken where the food pantry lives. How interesting is it? How interesting is it when there is a need that comes up, that it is the church that comes to raise whatever needs to be done to meet the need? That is what we do. That is following Jesus. That is incarnating God's grace into the world. We do it for no other reason than it needs to be done. We do no other reason than good will come from it. That's why we do so much of what we do. We do it because God asks us to. It is part of our journey of discipleship. Being a disciple isn't only just about ourselves. Being a disciple is also about taking what God has asked us to do and putting that out into the world. It is about incarnating for those who are around us the love and the grace that we experience here and in other places. That's who we are. Now, admittedly, there were no end of things I could have picked for this sermon, and I really just picked these two because I thought they made good stories and I had jokes for them. But this is by no means an exhaustive list of the good we do in this church. It is no by means an exhaustive list of the good work that the church does. There's a reason why so many universities and colleges and hospitals and children's home and all that kind of stuff started by a group of people of a particular faith. Right? There is a reason that so many of these things have the word Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist or Jewish or whatever it is on them, because as people of faith, we are called to take God's love and make it real to the world. It's something that people can see and taste and smell and touch. That is part of who we are as disciples, and we do it because God came to be with us. Because God said it's not good to do anything less than this. I'm going to go, and I'm going to go in person, and I'm going to bless those who are around me, and I'm going to trust that they will then turn and bless those that are around them. And that's how the good kingdom-building work that we are all called to be a part of gets done. We do our small piece of it here. Millions, billions of others of us do their piece where they can, and the world becomes a little bit more like the kingdom of God. That's why we pay. God came to be with us. So we should do the same.